When I was growing up, in the days where it somehow still felt like school holidays would drag on, once my sister and I had rewatched all of our VCR tapes 3 times and definite boredom had set in, we would ask our mother to make us a treasure hunt. Not only do my mother's custom treasure hunts have all the classic elements, a hand-drawn map, tea stained around the edges, with an X marks the spot, these carefully crafted expeditions would send you from clue to clue, scribbled on hidden post-it notes. My sister and I would race around rooms and yard, both trying to reach the final clue, to solve the last riddle and to find that final prize. And yet there would always be a twist, one that seemed to mean that each of us would find our own final prize at the same moment. And every time we would realise that these tournaments had always been prepared with 2 winners in mind. Our mother's way of forcing us from rivals to being both the best. We find ourselves this evening onlookers to a somewhat dramatic passage, a public confrontation, ongoing disputes and attempts to discredit Jesus coming to a head, and an exchange of multi-layered questions and answers. In the passage just before this, we see Jesus asked a somewhat ridiculous question by the scholars of the time. A question about who a person would be married to after death if they'd been married to 7 different people during their life. Yeah, it's not the question I would have picked to ask Jesus, but anyway. In today's passage, they seem to change tack, ramp up the pressure, if you like, moving from an outlandish question to what I think the Pharisees see as an impossible one. An expert in the law asked him a question to test him. When this passage says they were testing Jesus, I don't think they were checking if he'd studied up. And I don't think they were hoping that Jesus would have more wisdom than them. I think they expected him to not be able to provide a specific answer, to appear vague or non-committal or indecisive. After all, could he really dare to explicitly elevate one commandment above all the others? And once they'd proved Jesus wouldn't do that, maybe people would realise he wasn't so groundbreaking after all. It's a common tactic and one we still see working today. It's comparable to the classic political gotcha question. Minister, can you tell us the number 1 issue affecting Australians today? Minister, what do you say to those accusing you? Minister, what's the exact price of a litre of milk? Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And I suspect you've all seen a politician or whoever's fronting the press skillfully deflect this type of question. And a part of me expects Jesus to do the same, coming back with something along the lines of, well, we all know each commandment has importance and there's something to be taken from all of them. But Jesus gives them their answer, more than they ask for actually, laying out a clear hierarchy and elevating 2 commandments above the rest. The greatest and first commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And a second that is like it, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. I assume the Pharisees would have been slightly taken aback at this point. Not only is the answer not what they were expecting, but like my childhood treasure hunts, in calling out 2 commandments, it seems Jesus is doing a bit of a sneaky, they both win. I can't really pick between them, they're kind of both the best. Really? The disappointment we sometimes feel around 2 winners stems from what may be seen as a lack of a definitive answer, an inability we have to reconcile the paradox of 2 things being the best. And paradoxical is how it appears here too, if, like the Pharisees, you look at the commandments as a list of individual, unrelated instructions, and if you focus on how these 2 are different rather than like. When Jesus points to the 2nd commandment, you shall love your neighbour as yourself, he says it is like the first. What does that mean for something to be like something else? Does it mean similar in that they're both commandments? Does it mean because they both mention love, maybe? I have commonly heard these two commandments framed as one must come after the other, or after it therefore because of it. Because one thing occurs, it must have caused the later event. That is, if you love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, therefore of course you would follow God's commandments, one of which happens to be to love your neighbour. But here Jesus doesn't say that the love your neighbour command is after, or a result of, or related to the first thing. He says it is like it. I quite like collecting things, and one thing I have a collection of is maps of the London Underground. These little paper-free train line maps that you can pick up from tube stations in Britain. They all have these interesting different artworks on the cover. They show different combinations of underground and overground lines depending on what decade they were made in. And sometimes they have different special designs for events like the Olympics or the Jubilee. But they still belong in my collection together because they all have the same stops. They all show the same city and the same abstracted representation of the river. Fun fact, they all even have exactly the same font. And ultimately, they are like because they all have the same purpose. They all give the same guidance. They're all a representation of the one framework. And they'll get you to and from the same place at the end of the day. Maybe Jesus brings these two commandments together because they will both get us to the same place too. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Sometimes I find myself mentally paraphrasing this to mean love the Lord your God with your whole self. As if Jesus just says heart, soul and mind as a more poetic way of wording, give it all you've got. And that surely is part of it. But maybe we also revert to this summary because it's challenging to explain in detail exactly what it means to love God. It can be helpful to break it down a bit. For the greatest commandment, I should probably not be skipping over words. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. I think one aspect of what makes up our heart is what we are passionate about. Those things or skills or causes we cannot help but be drawn to by our hearts. The interests and values which our heart wants to focus in on. So rather than just a fuzzy feeling, I think we are called to figure out how these passions we have been given can become entwined with our love for God, how they can express or reflect or grow a love for God. Love the Lord your God with all your soul. I'm not going to attempt to definitively define what a soul is for the purposes of this framework, but some ways to think of it could be your sense of self, the accumulation of all aspects of our identity, the essence of who we are. And who we are, with our different aspects of our identities, helps us love God in our own individual and personal way. Love the Lord your God with all your soul can hardly look exactly the same for everybody when our souls are not all the same. But clearly God sees value in the diverse ways our love for her may be expressed. Love the Lord your God with all your mind. Rather than the idea of mind alluding only to academic or intellectual thought exercises, one way I find helpful to think about the concept of mind is the logical, the realistic, or in other words, how we navigate the everyday realities of life. Although we may sometimes have the privilege of using our minds for intellectual or theoretical exercise, more often than not, I find when my mind really has to do some work is when faced with realities that are far from ideal or easy, when there's no right answer, or even more difficult when there's more than one right answer. And if this commandment to love God is inherently interlinked with the concept of a practical, figuring out the hard stuff together kind of love, I think this brings us closer to understanding why in this passage we see the love of God so closely joined with love for our neighbour. How do we love our neighbours like this too, with our heart, passions and sense of value? with our soul, identity, and whole essence, with our minds, intellect, and logic. It's no small ask. And on top of all this, Jesus doesn't stop with love your neighbour. He also pops in as yourself. Why not just stop at love your neighbour? Surely, as we've established, that's the practical, important bit of this commandment. I suppose I've often thought of the as yourself bit to effectively mean put yourself in their shoes. Make sure you're loving others just as much as you love yourself. But what would happen if I was to love my neighbour with the exact same amount of love I often extend to myself? As my neighbour wakes up in the morning, I would say to them the same loving words I say to myself each morning. Why is it taking you so long to get up? Don't you know you're going to miss the train if you don't get a move on? As my neighbour struggles to prioritise their time while working from home, I would repeat to them that same loving mantra I often tell myself. Wow, Hannah, you've been doing this for 3 years. How have you not got the hang of it yet? And when I saw my neighbour disappointed when they'd put time and effort into something which didn't work out the way they'd planned, would I speak to them with the same grace I sometimes extend to myself? You didn't do a very good job of that, did you? I wonder what you might end up saying to your neighbour as yourself. Jesus doesn't just stop with love your neighbour. He includes as yourself, because if we are measly with the compassion we allow ourselves, this will inevitably have an impact on our capacity to love others. So alongside understanding this commandment to mean love your neighbour just as much as you love yourself, I think there's also space to read it as love your neighbour at the same time as you love yourself. So I'm left wondering, where might we even start at loving God, loving our neighbour, loving ourselves? Well, as for our hearts, I look at this congregation and see people using their passions to love God in creative ways. And I'd say join in and find the cause or skill or artistic medium that suits your heart and interweave it with a love for God. We're a diverse group of souls, and I find it a privilege to be able to learn from all the different expressions of people loving God in their own way in this congregation. Continue to worship and love God alongside people who might not be quite the same as yourself. As for loving with our minds, I see people here with a wide range of life experience, and I know for me, the way that people in this congregation have been generous with sharing their knowledge and advice and wisdom continues to be a meaningful, practical expression of God's love. I would suggest that for all these aspects, there is something to be said for tackling them together in community rather than always on our own. At the end of the passage, we are told, "Nor from that day did anyone dare to ask Jesus any more questions." And I can see why. The answers and commandments we are offered here are big asks that, if taken seriously, will have implications for how we look at God, ourselves, and others. But my hope for you is that you do keep asking questions. Questions that help you grow in the way you love other people. Questions that confront what we may have been told about loving ourselves. And questions that bring us closer to a forever mysterious and loving God.